You said that Ruben Gallego was controlled by the cartels. You provided no evidence.
Something unusual happens almost immediately in this hearing. A Senate confirmation hearing suddenly becomes a conversation about fathers. Senator Kaine isn't talking about diplomacy, qualifications, or policy anymore because he's trying to move the audience onto completely different ground. He's arguing that there are certain political attacks that don't simply challenge an opponent's ideas. They attempt to transfer guilt from one generation to another. The question quietly entering this hearing is surprisingly uncomfortable. If someone's father committed crimes decades ago, how much of that belongs to the son? Legally, the answer is obvious. Politically, the answer is much less clear. Modern politics often rewards associations more than evidence. A person doesn't necessarily have to do something wrong to become politically vulnerable. Sometimes merely being adjacent to something terrible is enough. Kaine understands that if the hearing remains focused on cartel accusations and campaign rhetoric, people will simply argue about facts. But if he can make the hearing about inherited blame and personal tragedy, then the entire moral framework changes. Suddenly the issue is no longer whether Ruben Gallego's father committed crimes. The issue becomes whether there are lines in politics that shouldn't be crossed at all. And once that question enters the room, it becomes much harder to separate the accusation itself from the way it was made.
Ms. Lake, in response to a question from Senator McCormick, you said that you were proud of the way you ran your campaigns in 2022 and 2024. I want to ask you a question. On September 27, 2024, you gave a TV interview about your opponent, then House member, now our colleague, Senator Gallego, in which you said he is, quote, controlled by the cartels. His own father was a Colombian drug trafficker, and so he's got links to the cartel. A PolitiFact article on October 3, a few days later, rated that pants on fire. And the title of the article, and I'd like to submit it for the record, Mr. Chair, is In Arizona Senate Race, Kari Lake Fabricates Link Between Ruben Gallego and Drug Cartels. Now, this is pretty undiplomatic behavior. And just for my colleagues, I hope you might read this story. Ruben, our colleague, has written a memoir about his very troubled upbringing and about the fact that he was abandoned by his father, who then did get into criminal trouble. He was abandoned by his father. He had to be raised by his mother. He was so furious at his father that he changed his last name to be his mother's maiden name, not his father's name. He talks about graduating from boot camp as a Marine, and after years of abandonment, his dad tried to show up and take credit for his own graduation from Marine boot camp. And he writes about how furious that made him and still makes him. He writes about how ashamed he is of his father, how angry he is at his father. Abandonment by a father is one of the most seminal tragedies of life. I mean, go back to the biblical phrase, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? This is not something to fool around with.
This is where the hearing quietly changes categories. Up to this point, it appears to be an argument over a campaign statement. Then Senator Kaine asks a much more dangerous question. Did Kari Lake actually have evidence for the claim that Ruben Gallego was controlled by cartels? Notice what Kaine is doing here. He isn't trying to prove Gallego innocent. Instead, he's trying to establish something potentially more damaging. He's trying to show that the accusation can survive even when the person making it cannot fully defend it. That distinction matters because allegations and evidence operate under completely different rules. Evidence has standards, it can be tested, challenged, and disproven. Allegations only need attention. Once an accusation enters public conversation, it can begin shaping reputations long before anyone asks whether it was true. In a strange way, this hearing is exposing one of the weaknesses of modern public life. Institutions move slowly. Verification takes time. But accusations move instantly. By the time evidence catches up, the allegation may already have done its work. That is why Kaine keeps returning to the same point. He isn't simply asking whether the accusation was true. He's asking whether public officials have any obligation to revisit explosive claims after they become politically useful. Because if they don't, then the incentive structure becomes deeply lopsided. The reward comes from making the accusation, while the cost of proving it may never arrive.
Ms. Lake, accused one of our sitting colleagues of being controlled by the cartels. You had no evidence then, nor do you have any evidence now, that our colleague Senator Gallego is controlled by cartels, do you, Ms. Lake?
Well, we provided the receipts. The father was a high-level drug trafficker, trafficking hundreds of thousands.
You said that Ruben Gallego was controlled by the cartels. You provided no evidence. This was rated pants on fire, a lie. You had no evidence then, and you have no evidence now that Ruben Gallego is controlled by cartels. Isn't that right?
I thank you for the question, Senator Kaine. I do appreciate it. I don't know, and I'm not here to do reputational control or reputational
How about an
repair.
apology?
Perhaps the most revealing moment in this hearing isn't that Kari Lake refuses to apologize. It's that an apology would have required her to absorb a political cost. Retractions are expensive in politics because apologies can sound like weakness and admissions can be framed as surrender. Public figures know this. They understand that walking back an explosive statement can sometimes generate more negative attention than making the statement in the first place. As a result, public life occasionally creates a strange incentive structure in which the cost of making a dramatic accusation is lower than the cost of taking it back. That idea is much bigger than this hearing. It's bigger than Kari Lake, Ruben Gallego, or Senator Kaine. Institutions depend on something fragile. They depend on the belief that facts eventually matter enough to change behavior. They depend on the expectation that evidence can still correct falsehood and that accountability eventually follows unsupported claims. But this hearing leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. What happens if those assumptions stop being true? What happens if accusations become permanent while corrections remain optional? And if political incentives reward repetition more than reconsideration, how do reputations ever recover once they've been damaged? That may be the real issue underneath this hearing. It isn't simply whether an allegation was proven. It's whether modern politics still contains meaningful incentives to care whether it was proven at all.
If you made that claim he was controlled by cartels, and now you're saying you don't know what the facts are, then you're acknowledging that your charge was wrong. How about apologizing to our colleague?
I don't believe my charge was wrong.
Okay,
Ruben Gallego's father is a high-level
That's not the question I asked you.
He was a felon.
That's not the question. You asserted he was controlled by cartels. You had no evidence then. You have no evidence now. You're unwilling to admit it. And here's something that's even worse, Mr. Chair. That was during the heat of a campaign. Sometimes we say things during campaigns that we go too far. She's continued to repeat this as a sitting member of the Trump administration. A couple months ago, Ruben Gallego put out a tweet against the invasion of Venezuela. He didn't mention Ms. Lake. He just said he was against it. And she, at 2:35 in the morning the following day, responded, "You are a member of a Mexican cartel family. You are also a fraud. No one is surprised by your take." She's continuing to repeat a lie. She just told the committee she has no idea whether it's true or false, but she was glad to say it, and she won't retract it now. That should be